And so I've gone ahead and muted you all. But what I will do, and that's just more for sound quality and things like that, but what I do request from you today is to participate a little bit in the chat. I will have a few questions for you, so feel free to pop in there so that we can have a little bit more back and forth as well. Um, and for those of you who don't know me, my name is Abby Chan. I am a registered dietitian and I am the dietitian who's contracted with NAPEPT and Vera. And what I do is I focus not only on overall nutrition, obviously, as a dietitian, that's what I do, but I really work a lot on individuals and their relationship to food. For a lot of us, we've probably been through a lot of dieting regimes or regimens or things like that. And typically, what I have found is they typically leave us feeling less motivated and leave us feeling a little bit less than when we even started. So I really work on individuals' relationship to food, not only in a mental aspect, but also from a physical aspect. And then also looking at a lot of what is the zooming out and looking at what does health mean to each of us as individuals, and how do we start to meet those needs from a nutrition standpoint as well. So today we are going to be talking about emotional eating during the holidays and how to look at having a more mindful holiday season. We're already kind of in the midst of holidays and all of that. Obviously, we've already, excuse me, had Thanksgiving and are kind of in the full swing of all of it. So I want to just have this conversation here and now so that we can take the rest of the next of our month to have a little bit more time to hopefully decrease a little anxiety around the holidays, but also have more time that we can actually deeply connect, because that's really what the holidays are typically about. For everyone who's just joining, I'm Abby Chan. I'm a registered dietitian. Some of you may know me through working through NAPEPT or VERA, things like that. I have gone ahead and muted most of you so that we can just have good sound quality. If there is a question, feel free to reach out. Also, again, I am going to ask you to participate a little bit in the chat box as well. Okay, so let's dive in. One thing I forgot to mention as well is I'm the co-owner of Evolve Flagstaff, which is an integrative health facility where we work on helping you do what you love for life, which means that we are working on nutrition, injury prevention through physical therapy. We do have a gym space and also a meal prep program so that people just have food available that's easy, healthy, and simple. Okay, so a little overview of what we are going to be discussing today is we're going to talk about why we eat as humans, right? We know that, yes, there's a lot of reasons why we eat, but we're going to really dive into what that means for us and how that shows up. We're going to start to look at different types of hunger and obviously specifically looking at emotional eating. We're going to look at getting back in touch with some of our hunger cues and how we can really utilize this as a tool specifically around the holiday season so that we can start to feel a little bit more grounded, but also not feel like as soon as January 1st hits that we feel like we need to quote unquote get back on track. And we're also going to look at some other healthful takeaways so that you can feel grounded and good through this holiday season. Okay, so here's where you are going to participate in the chat for me. I want you to take a moment to think about what are some of the most important parts or part of the holiday season for you. So throw something in the chat box of whether, okay, cool, making cookies with your mom. Love that, Erica. Spending time with family. Awesome. Sweets, breads, time with family. I love that. Cool. Okay, well, thank you for participating. And as we've noticed, all of these things that are most important to us typically have something in common. So it's some form of connection, right? So maybe it's memories, maybe it's even decorating, whether it be the tree or decorating for Hanukkah or whatever it is that you celebrate. A lot of times it's also tradition. And also even that anticipation aspect, right? Like we all remember when we were kids and there was that giddy anticipation of getting ready for whether it be Santa or presents or getting family together. And I think one big aspect, which we're talking about today, is also food. Food is one of the deep connectors that we'll dive deeply into today of why we eat and things like that. But food is something that will always bring us together. And this time of year should be a time of year that brings joy, connection, and reflection. Over the last few years, we have most likely spent a lot less time with loved ones and have even lost some of those who are really important to us. And so I do feel that this holiday season and going forward are going to be a time that we should really look at reflecting, at looking at how can we be most present with those who are most important to us. Typically, a lot of things that we talk about and hear about during the holiday season is staving off and fighting off that holiday weight gain or getting back on track after the holidays. And so we'll talk a lot about that too. And I just want to even note first and foremost that a lot of times that if we are stressed or in a space where have anxieties around body, food, all of that is what that does is that automatically takes us out of the present moment and takes us out of being able to be actually aware and with those people that we are trying most deeply to connect with. And looking through the chat box, you've noticed that all the things that are most important to us are have nothing to do with weight, right? So I think that's one thing to also remember too, is that even though we hear a lot of scare tactics around weight and weight loss and all of that during the holiday season, and especially afterwards, knowing that it's really not the most important part of the holiday season for us. All right, so let's talk about why we eat, right? So food has always brought connection and has always brought individuals and people together. So food, yes, we know is necessary for survival. We all know that if we didn't eat and we didn't drink water, we would die. And so we know that it's necessary, but it's also so much more than that. We don't just eat for nutritional purposes. Food connects us to each other. It's actually a way that we build identities and memories and also connect to the world around us as well. It's a way that we can also share trust and show that we trust each other. So even when you look at sharing food historically throughout ages, it's been a way that we have forged treaties and joined communities together and joined nations together. So food is a really, really important part of showing trust amongst each other. When we also look at, there's a more of from a psychological and social science standpoint, there's this theory called attachment theory. And so attachments are made when we are really, really young. So they're made with our caregivers. And basically there's a variety of there's 4 different types of attachment styles. But when we start to look at them, if someone has had a disruption, that typically there's also a disruption in how that individual relates to food. And so security and attachment will actually determine our ability to share food, commune with food, and engage with food. There's actually fascinating research that shows, not that you have to share every meal with your romantic partner or anything like that, but it's one thing that is an important factor in a lot of romantic relationships, and food preference and the way that we commune with food as individuals is actually one thing that is a big identifier in how successful is a relationship. So food is deep. Food is much more than just calories in and calories out. And food also brings a lot of tradition and values and seeps in those cultural norms. So for Hanukkah, one of the reasons why fried food, specifically latkes, are served is because they represent the small amount of oil that burned for 8 days straight. So that's a way to celebrate that. When we think about Christmas, there's typically, depending on families and things like that, there's typically some sort of meat served. And what that means is that's a sign of abundance and a sign of celebration, especially previously and many generations before, we didn't have as much access to these things. And there was typically a lot of work that involved getting meat instead of just going to the grocery store. So it was a way that people could celebrate and share that abundance with each other. So we now kind of have an idea of why we eat. So yes, we eat for nutrition and calories and things like that. We also eat to bring us together, and we eat to make memories and create memories and pass on cultural traditions. We also tell stories through that. And because food is such an integral part of humanity and connection, and even comfort, that's, I think, where we end up with a lot of friction when it comes to anxiety around food and anxiety around our bodies in general. And so, one thing I like to think about, even when we talk about the comfort aspect of food, is food has always brought us comfort. Food should always be able to bring us comfort. And the reason why is because, again, early in those attachment stages, when we're tiny babies, or if you have children yourself, when a baby cries, typically what will happen is that child will be held and they will often be fed. So, we can't take the comfort out of food. And that's not a bad thing. I think a lot of times food and comfort eating is thought of as a quote unquote bad thing. And it's not inherently, because we can't actually disentangle that. And so when it comes to a lot of food anxiety, and specifically around holidays, we can look up like how to have healthier holidays, how to healthify your favorite family recipes. And while I'm all into getting veggies in and things like that, we'll talk about that later. What this also does is this can create more anxiety in us. What that does is that can also, again, inhibit our ability to be present with people and with others, because we're either thinking about how many calories did I eat? I shouldn't eat that. That's a quote unquote bad food. I've had too much. And what it does is, again, it takes us out of this present moment and actually creates a deep disconnect. And so, disconnection specifically, from a mental standpoint, and psychological standpoint, is that disconnection or feeling rejected or feeling like we have some disconnection within ourselves actually is processed through some of the same places in our brain that physical pain is. So actually that disconnection or that anxiety will even be processed in the same way as pain is. So it can actually have these bigger effects on our bodies and our physiology as well. So again, it's going to separate us from our communities, and it's also going to separate us typically from our values. For me personally, I am a Chinese American, so I'm half Chinese. My mom is white, and so growing up, we always had these really big, wild holidays where it was half Chinese food, and half like traditional American holiday foods. And through that, for a long time, just even on a personal note, I struggled with my relationship to food. And what happened was I wouldn't partake in a lot of those foods, and specifically a lot of the Chinese foods, because when you think about those foods, typically it's more rice-based things, noodle-based things, carb-based things. And those were, when I was growing up, were deemed as quote unquote unhealthy because of the world and society that we live in. And so what that did, and like fast forward years later, my grandpa's now passed on, and there's a big gap there is where I feel even like grief and regret, because I'm like, I didn't get to enjoy those foods, and I didn't get to commune in those traditional ways and connecting with my culture because of my own personal food anxieties and things like that. So we're going to try to hopefully stave off any of that for you, and hopefully give you a little bit more grace during this time. So let's talk about why we eat in general and different types of hunger, because I think this is a really great way that we can start to dive into identifying what do we need. A lot of times we think that hunger is a conscious thing, that it's like, oh, I'm hungry, so I'm going to eat something, or I'm hungry, I'm choosing to abstain from food right now, so I'm not going to eat something. So I'm either restricting calories or on a diet or something like that. And what actually happens is, because as humans, we need to also remember that we are animals with also a lot of really complex emotions on top of that, but our bodies are made to survive. First and foremost, they are made to survive. So in some way, shape, or form, if we are restricting them, they will find a way to get their needs met. And so if anyone here has ever been on some sort of restrictive diet or tried to limit their calories for a period of time, if it ever got to a point where you're like, I feel now out of control, that's because hunger isn't as conscious as we think it is, and it lives more in our subconscious, even reptilian brains. So let's dive into hunger. To me, there are four, with one subgroup, types of hunger that we are going to go over today. And so first and foremost, there's physical hunger. This is one that we're all familiar with, right? So this is we identify this as eating in response to physical or mental hunger cues. So this is like, my stomach's growling, I have lower energy, I'm feeling a little bit short tempered, I'm feeling hangry, even anxiety. Sometimes that can be a sign of hunger for some individuals. I'm feeling dizzy, I'm feeling shaky, I'm feeling lightheaded, even feeling hot or cold. All of these things can be signs of physical hunger. The issue is that we typically only wait until we get our stomach growling, and that's a lot of people's first and only cue that they're hungry and that they need food, without recognizing all of the other aspects around why we might need to eat and what are some other signs that our bodies are telling us. When it comes to physical hunger as well, what will happen, and this is kind of where the intersection of physical and emotional come in, is that if you're in an energy deficit, which means that you're not getting enough food, so you don't have enough calories coming in. I'll use calories and the word energy interchangeably. If we are in an energy deficit, either for a day or even for a longer, prolonged period of time, what will typically happen is, again, that reptilian brain of like, I need to survive, will start to kick in. And that's when food will start to feel really out of control, very urgent. And typically that's where we will start to feel unsatisfied. Even if we've had a full normal meal, we will start to feel unsatisfied or feel like we haven't met our needs. Then, when we start to dive into functional hunger, this is a little bit different. So, this is more so eating for functional reasons. So, eating because we have to, not because our stomach is growling. And so, this could be due to all of us who have busy work schedules. Oftentimes, we have a time in our day that we are either allotted a lunch break or a time for lunch, whether we're hungry or not. And so that's where it's really like to think of functional hunger as planning for our future selves. And so that's where it's like, okay, I'm not hungry, but it's noon, it's my lunch break, so I have to eat now so that I can show up in the rest of my day. This also comes in handy. I work with a lot of athletes. This also comes in handy for a lot of individuals who are very active. For people who are either athletes or exercise a lot, what exercise will do is actually decrease and depress our hunger signals for a period of time. Does that mean that you don't need to eat after you have exerted a lot of energy or physically challenged your body? No, not at all. It means that we still need to eat, but we're eating from a reason that isn't because I'm physically hungry. It's because I know that I need to eat to take care of myself. This can also show up often when we're sick or even traveling. I think around the holiday times as well. If you're getting on an airplane and you have a 5-hour flight, you may not be hungry getting on the plane, but you know that once you get off the plane, you may be a hangry monster. So you should probably take care of yourself beforehand. There's also reasons that we may do this for health reasons. If you're looking at blood sugar control or things like that, there may be times where you're like, I'm not really hungry, but I know that I don't want my blood sugar to tank, so I'm going to eat something so that I can take care of myself. Hopefully both of these are sounding somewhat familiar to you so far. And now let's dive into the emotional aspect of eating. So again, we can't take the emotion out of eating because the holidays are inherently intertwined with food, and food is deeply intertwined with connection and emotions. And even when we think about someone, Erica mentioned in the chat, of like making cookies with my mom, right? Like that is such a deeply emotional and special thing that if we were to automatically say like, oh, well, cookies are quote unquote bad, if we have this very black and white thinking around these things, what that does is that also means that like maybe we won't have that time to connect, or we won't take that time because we don't want to deal with the anxiety of having cookies in our house. So I think that's one thing to remember about emotional eating. Emotional eating also is often confused with the physical aspect, because sometimes if we're physically really, really hungry and say we've totally blown past lunch and haven't even tapped in, and it's like 3 or 4 p.m. and we feel like stressed and short-tempered, we may say that that is an emotion, which it definitely is, but typically you're feeling that emotion because your body hasn't had its needs met. So it actually goes more into that physical bucket as opposed to the emotional bucket. Emotional eating is looking, and if we break it down fully, it's really eating in response to an unmet emotional need, and that isn't based on hunger. So this could be for a lot of individuals, could be comfort, could be for distraction. So more of a dissociation of like, I don't want to deal with all the things that I have going on right now. So I'm going to choose to eat instead because that's a really easy way to take my mind off it. Obviously, disconnection is, or distraction is deeply intertwined with stress, and also even inadequacy. So even like that own self-worth for us too, of like if we feel like we are not enough, sometimes we will try to often fill that void with food. And this actually goes way back. So again, thinking about those early attachment styles when we're younger, what happens is that as we're children, we don't have a lot of autonomy. We don't have a lot of ways that we can comfort ourselves. And especially if we're not getting comfort from either caregivers or those around us, or if we're also not able to soothe ourselves with other things, then we will often turn to food because that's the only thing that's available to us. A lot of times in a adolescent or even childhood brain, we don't have the ability to rationalize like this is what I'm feeling, and I'm doing this in response to this. We also can't typically like drive ourselves to therapy or be like, oh, I'm gonna go take a walk right now to release stress, right? Typically food is the only thing that we have available to us to bring comfort. And food does bring comfort, not only for the social reasons and connection, but also typically when we are eating food, it will have a hormonal response. It will have a neurochemical response, meaning that it will release dopamine and serotonin, which actually help calm our bodies down and calm our brains down and do give us that sense of release for a moment. To me, emotional eating is never banned or bad. And this is because, again, we can't take the emotions out of eating. The where we start to run into issues with emotional eating is when it comes to emotional eating. Say it's in the middle of the day and I finish this lecture and it really stresses me out and I have to jump into an appointment next, but I only have 5 minutes to kind of find a little bit of resolve or find a little bit of that moment to breathe. Sometimes a cookie is the only thing I have time for in that moment, right? And it will make me feel better for a period of time. What it won't do is it won't actually help us resolve that stress response, and it won't actually help us resolve and get to that underlying level of comfort, or it won't help us resolve our huge list of things that we have to do, or our sense of enoughness or a sense of inadequacy, right? And so that's where I find it's really, really helpful to look at food can always be on the table, because the moment that we restrict something or say we can't have it, that's where our brain is like, that's the only thing I can think about, and that's all that I want. And so it's more so looking at how do we have this emotional toolbox that we can look at, of where food is always on the table and always an available option, but also what are some other things not to do in place of food or in lieu of food, but things that are actually going to help us get to the root and bottom of that emotion. So if it's comfort, right? So maybe that's something where it's like, I'm feeling disconnected. I need to comfort myself. Maybe that's going to be calling a friend. Maybe if you have a partner at home, maybe it's like taking a moment to just like walk in the door and like get a hug. What that actually does is emotionally, that actually does release a lot of the same hormones and chemicals that food does and gives us that same response. If it's distraction, if you just need that moment, maybe other things that you could also put in that toolbox would be some sort of like movement. Maybe it's some sort of journaling or drawing. Maybe it's something else that can take you out of what's really stressful for that moment, that can help you process and then bring you back in. If it's stress, another thing is movement and exercise. We'll use those words interchangeably as well. That's actually one of the best ways that we can actually relieve stress, especially on a day-to-day basis. We'll talk a little bit about that. Exercise shouldn't be your only stress outlet. We should also look at how do we manage stress on the forefront so it doesn't get out of control and feel like we always need to de-stress ourselves, but it can be a really helpful tool. When it comes to whether it be like inadequacy or looking for finding that comfort through food, or if that's again our only tool, this is actually where I often work a lot with therapists or even coaches or things like that that are working on that side of how do we start to help you feel like you can find some of that enoughness in yourself. So, as you can see, emotional eating is big and there's a lot to think about, but I would encourage you to look at like, how do I find this toolbox of things and that will be helpful for me to have as a menu or an option when I'm feeling this way? Because first and foremost, when we are eating and eating for emotional reasons, we first need to be able to stop and recognize, like, oh, I'm eating this because I'm feeling this way. So that's always step one. Step two is then looking at, like, what's in my toolbox and what do I have access and availability to right now? So do I have 5 minutes and I can't go for a walk and I can't call a friend and I don't have anyone to hug right now and I can't go take a bath or whatever it is. I can't get my to-do list done. Maybe again, that only leaves you with that cookie, but then at the end of the day, we want to look at, can we pick that up later and check in with ourselves and be like, am I still feeling this? How do I actually get to a resolve with this? Because again, cookies only gonna last for so long, can be really helpful for a moment, but it's not gonna last forever. Okay, then, when we think about emotional eating, there's another aspect, and this is why I say there's 4 types of hunger with a little subgroup in there. And so, this is what I refer to as compulsive eating. And these are often very confused because compulsive eating often feels very emotional as well. Compulsive eating is always in reaction and in relation to some sort of restriction. And so that may mean, again, more of that like calorie restriction of not eating enough and not giving your body enough nutrients. If anyone's ever been on a pretty strict diet where it's like, I do quote unquote really good during the week, but then the weekends I just like can't quote unquote control it. And the reason why is, again, your body's trying to get its needs met. So it will probably eat urgently, quickly, and we may not have that mental awareness that we're doing it. Compulsive eating is also where it's another example that I like to use is like, well, I just can't keep it in the house because if I keep it in the house, I'll blow through that bag of Oreos instantly, right? And so, again, this is because we have put the self imposed restriction or put foods in categories that are black and white, so good or bad. An Oreo isn't inherently bad. It typically comes down to the volume and the quantity and why we're doing it, right? And also, how aware are we when we're eating them? So if we blow through a whole row of Oreos and we're like, I don't even remember what that tasted like, we're probably not actually getting those benefits of like connection and joy and taste with that food. One thing that I often like to ask people when I'm having this conversation is, when it comes to compulsive eating, a lot of times people say like, oh, well, I'm addicted to this or I can't have this. And if some people will also clump or group this into binge eating as well. And so when it comes to binge eating, I ask them oftentimes, if it were a true binge eating disorder, we would be eating absolutely anything and everything in sight. Typically, that's not the case for most people. One thing I like to ask, like, have you ever binged broccoli? Most of the time, people typically say no. And one of the reasons why is we probably get really full. So there's one. B is because we've also never told ourselves that we can't have it. So we've never made that mental connection where it's like, this is bad, this is forbidden, I shouldn't have this thing. We've always given ourselves permission to be like, I can eat as much broccoli as I want. It's available whenever I want it. I can grab it at the store whenever I want to. And so it doesn't have that same relationship. And so one thing that we can do to decrease this compulsivity around eating is to try to not group foods in this very black and white category, right? So when we look at, again, at Oreo, what's it made of? It's made up of fat and some carbs and sugar, which are also carbs. And that's about it. And when we actually break down carbohydrates, it's like, okay, it's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. I know that because this is what I do for a job. But really, it's like a lot of other things are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen as well. Say, take a banana or even an apple. Yes, the banana and apple are going to offer other nutrients as well, but they also may not. If you're really craving one specific thing, it's probably not going to scratch that itch, and you may end up eating 50 things before you finally get to that Oreo and you're like, oh, that's all I wanted, right? So it's more so when it comes to compulsive eating, it's getting out of that binary of the black and white of this is good, this is bad, and really zooming out and looking at in context of, okay, when I'm eating this thing, am I aware? Can I also have it with other foods that I know are going to be filling and satiating and sustaining for me? And how do I get out of this restrictive mindset around this food? We see this oftentimes, this restrictive mindset around food and money. So this is something that is documented well. It's called a scarcity mindset. There's a really fascinating podcast. It's called Hidden Brain. That's all about this. That kind of talks about food and money, and they're both currencies, and they're both things that we need to live. So they have a lot of similarities. And so we find that if people have either been in a self-imposed restriction, so they have either chosen to go on a diet or have not given themselves enough food, or if someone is in a restriction due to financial reasons because there is not enough food available, and specifically in early childhood years, what will typically happen is once you have not been able to hold on anymore or deny yourself anymore, that's when individuals will end up eating a large amount of either a certain food or all food, depending on what they've restricted at one time. And that's where it starts to look, that's where it starts to become problematic. And if we can start to, and if we have access to normalizing some of these foods that have been deemed as bad or quote unquote unhealthy or things like that, that is one thing that's actually going to help us restore our relationship to those foods so they don't feel like they're talking to us. Like that's one thing people are like, well, I can't keep it in the house because I feel like it's talking to me and I know I'm going to eat it. And I'm like, for sure, if you bring it in your house, you're probably going to eat it. But it's all about that relationship and urgency and time frame and amount that we're eating it in. And that's the main thing that is also going to matter when it comes to overall health and health outcomes. When we zoom into health, we can't just look at the physical, so the nutrition, exercise, disease aspect. We need to look at overall mental health and zoom out too of like, what is our relationship to those things? And if our relationship to food is damaged or harmed, then that's also going to deeply impact our relationship with ourselves, our ability to connect with others, and is going to take up a lot of brain space and mental power that we'd probably like to use elsewhere. Okay, so that is the third and subtext of emotional eating, third and ish type of hunger. The last one is taste. So taste is a type of hunger that is eating outside of physical hunger or function. It's really just eating for taste alone. And we've all probably experienced this before, where it's typically like some sort of craving. And normally, I like to use an example of like, say you're out at a restaurant and you've had a full meal where you're like, I know that I'm not physically hungry. I don't need to eat out of a functional reason. And this isn't a deeply emotional thing, but I just want a little bit of something else, or that dessert looks really interesting or tasty. And so typically that's what that taste is, where it's like it normally doesn't take a lot of it. We don't have to consume a lot of it to feel like we've met that need. Normally it's just a little bit, maybe it's a few bites of something, depends on what you need, but maybe it's just a few bites of something. And typically that ends that resolve, and we start to find some resolve through that taste aspect of hunger. If there's any questions about any of this, feel free to pop them in the chat as well, or you can also unmute yourself. So when we think about hunger, to recap this very long slide, it's important to remember that hunger is much more than just needing food. It is deeply connected and interconnected with our mental and emotional state. And anytime we deprive ourselves of any one of these things, that's when we start to feel really out of control. Okay. So I will kind of breeze over this because I've kind of talked about this before, but typically this is a picture of the binge restrict cycle. And so this will happen typically often in a lot of like dieting or programs or things like that, where we will end up restricting, where it's like we're eating less than we need, we're restricting food or food groups or specific foods in order to feel quote unquote in control, right? And we can typically do this for a period of time. What eventually will happen is we will start to feel really anxious. There's actually a lot of research that goes into looking at a malnourished brain. So a brain that doesn't have adequate nutrients or energy coming in is actually a very irrational and anxious brain as well, which is also why when it comes to tapping into food and hunger cues, that's why I like to look at, all right, what are your signs of hunger that aren't just physical, but are also maybe more mental? So if anxiety is something that you notice comes up a lot for you, and maybe when you're hungry, that may be one of your signs of hunger. This deprivation state will also, again, create that urgency around food where we have to spend a lot of mental energy to continue to restrict or think a lot about not doing it. And then eventually we end up in the kind of like screw it mentality. We eventually give in which eventually leads us to typically feeling out of control. It also makes us feel oftentimes like a failure, especially if we've been trying to do something healthful for ourselves. And then we quote unquote give in, we feel like we've screwed up. And what will happen in more of this binge state is that we will always eat more than we're comfortable with, meaning that we will probably walk away and be like, why did I do that? I feel uncomfortable. I don't feel good in my body. I feel tired. I feel sluggish. I feel too full. I feel bloated, all of these different things. And so a lot of these things will then result in guilt and shame. So again, feeling like you failed, a intense feeling of needing to regain that control. Like, I'll do better tomorrow. I'm not going to miss my workout tomorrow. All of these things are going to continue and perpetuate this cycle of then restriction, deprivation, binging, guilt, and shame. And so what this cycle also does is when we look at this scarcity mindset, it ingrains this food scarcity mindset because there's an abundance and then there's a restriction. So there's nothing. So it goes from a lot to a little. And what that does mentally is, again, it makes us feel like this is clearly a item that we have a scarcity and a limited source of. So I might as well get all that I can while I'm here and in this moment. And we also see this exact same cycle, not only maybe for some people it's on a daily basis, maybe it's weekly, maybe it's around dieting, but also if you zoom out and look at our calendar year, right? If I were to bet, we would be considered overall in more of a binge realm right now around the holidays. And then once January 1st hits, that guilt and shame comes in and that restriction. And so when we think about this from even a calendar and social standpoint, this is so normalized within our culture, which is why we often feel really out of control and feel like we don't have autonomy over our own food and choices because of how we relate to food from a societal level. It's really important to remember as well that no one meal or workout will make you or break you. It's how you show up frequently and consistently most of the time. So if you do something to where you're like, all right, I'm going to work out 7 days a week, let's say January 1st, right? A lot of people have a lot of resolutions, which I don't think are inherently bad, but we need to make sure that they're going to be sustainable. So if we're looking at January 1st, say you go into it in a not super sustainable way, like, I'm going to work out every single day this week, and maybe that lasts for like 2 weeks, but then life happens and we get into this very black and white mental state where it's like, well, if it's not perfect, then what's the point of doing it, right? And so it's important to understand that, like, a little bit matters, and it's more of that little bit over a long period of time that's going to have the most, that's going to be the most sustainable and have the biggest and best health outcomes, not only physically but also mentally. Okay, so you may be asking me, possibly, of like, but Abby, what about health? Aren't you a dietitian? It sounds like you're just telling me to eat whatever I want and not feel guilty about it. And I am telling you to do that, but let's dive into this a little bit more. So, this is a really helpful tool that I like to use when it comes to assessing our own hunger and fullness and satiation. So, satiation is a fancy word for being like, I'm good. I'm actually done with food now. And so, if we start to think about this as more of a pendulum, when we are on the ends and there's a lot of tension, if you've ever taken physics or things like that, full disclosure, I didn't. I chose a different degree that didn't involve physics. But when we are in this large point of tension, what will happen is that if we are going into either a meal or a day and we're totally empty and haven't met our needs, of course, when we finally get to a mealtime or food becomes available, we will end up eating quickly and very urgently. And typically, we won't be able to be present or aware of, like, what am I feeling? How am I feeling? Do I want more of this? And typically, we end up with an empty plate in front of us and we're like, ugh, now I don't feel very good. And so, what I would encourage you all to do is, typically, I like to go through this and just put it into quadrants. Some people like to assign numbers to it. I feel like that gets a little too wishy-washy and complicated. So I just like to think of this as like a gas tank, a little bit of like, empty is you're running on E, you're running on fumes, you have to get to the gas station. Quarter tank's like, all right, I should probably fill up now. That would be a responsible thing so I don't end up broken down on the highway. When we get into a neutral space, this is where we should feel pretty comfortable and energized and fine. So, this is where we're not worried about where's our next meal coming from. And we're also not super full and concerned about, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I ate so much. When we get into more of the 3/4 realm, that's generally between 3/4 and around full, is typically where most people feel pretty comfortable. When it comes to eating, we've probably all heard like the 80% rule, like eat until you're 80% full. What does 80% full mean for most people? Most people have no idea. And so, what this could mean is like, sure, I could take a few more bites of this, but maybe it's not tasting as good as my first few bites did. I feel like I'm slowing down. I feel less interested in this food. And those can be some more subtle cues to understand of like, okay, I'm probably done eating. Another thing too that the scarcity mindset will get us into is it makes us feel like we have to get everything in now because either we aren't going to get more later, or if someone's ever calorie counter or things like that, we have this budget, and if we don't eat this dinner that we've allotted for ourselves, then we're going to have to like figure out all the math behind it, and we might as well just eat all of it. And so that's, I think, too, where sometimes this more of this restrictive mentality can get a little bit hairy when it comes to food and food intake when we aren't able to listen to what we need. So I can send this out to everyone, and I can share this with you all as a tool to utilize. And what I like to do is I like to identify at least 1 to 3 in each of these categories, 1 to 3 like things and symptoms that you're feeling, whether that be mental, emotional, or physical, that you're feeling at each stage of this pendulum so that you can more easily tap in to how you're feeling and what your body needs. I find a lot of times because there is obviously we're in a big food season. If you are going into a meal and you are fully hungry, a lot of times people like won't eat on Thanksgiving or Christmas Day until we get to a big meal. Well, what is that going to do? We're going to end up fully empty, running on fumes, probably not going to be present with those around us because we may be grumpy or hangry or tired. And then inherently, what's going to happen is because we're not able to pay as deeply attention to what we need, oftentimes in social situations, we will blow past that 3/4, that 80%, and end up being full or over full, which doesn't feel good, which often will lead to that guilt and shame cycle. It's also important to remember when we do feel over full, is that this feeling will pass. You will probably need to eat again in anywhere from 3 to 6 hours, and your body can handle it. Your body can handle one meal. Your body can handle one day that may be a little bit more excessive or indulgent than others. But again, it's more of how do we show up on a daily basis that's really going to matter. And how are we also listening into what we need? Okay, so this is also, again, a big scare tactic. So I want you to participate in the chat again. True or false, the average American gains 7 to 10 pounds over the holiday season, which is Halloween through New Year's. But we got a 50-50 here. We got a true and a false and a true and a true. True, true, true. Okay, great. This is actually false. So this is a scare tactic that, again, we hear a lot because, yes, food is a big part of this time of year. This was actually a big study that was done, and I think it's really important when we look at research of does this population actually represent our lives, right? So this population, there was about 3,000 participants in the United States, Germany, and Japan, and it was all based around, these were all adults, and they took their weight over a 12-month period, and they averaged it on a monthly basis, and then they took their weight every single day, 10 days before and 10 days after. What they actually found was that there was a very minimal weight gain. So for those in the US, it was a weight gain of 0.4% of their average annual yearly weight, not including the holidays. In Germany, that was 0.6, and in Japan, that was 0.3. And what this actually works out to is about a less than a 1 pound gain for the average adult. Is that surprising to anyone? Yep. Okay. Cool. And so I think because there's so much money involved within the, and like, Yes, I own a gym. I am a dietitian, all these things. I have products that could be utilized and weaponized on January 1st for me to make a lot of money, but I don't do that because I don't believe in it. Because again, I believe in more sustainable things, but that's because there's all of this fear and anxiety around the holidays of new year, new you, getting back on track. And there's a lot of money involved in this as well. So it's important to actually look at like, can we, before we see a lot of sensationalized headlines, can we actually look at some of the data and also look at why this exists? I'm not going to say, again, the average weight gain was about 1 pound, which means that the average, some people didn't gain any weight, but also some people gained weight. And so the reason why the number on the scale increases right after the holidays is typically due to water retention. And so, especially for someone who weighs themselves frequently or even daily, there can be somewhere between a 1 to 5 pound difference, sometimes 1 to 8 pound difference, depending on the size of your body, on a daily basis. And specifically after the holidays, the reason why is due to water retention. So this is because typically the foods we're eating are going to be higher in salt, which is also sodium, so same thing. Which what that does is that actually pulls water and makes our body hold on to more water than we would normally. So again, thinking of like a roasted ham, if that's part of your holiday, like that's a pretty salty food. Mashed potatoes, that's not one thing that we're really concerned about typically, but there is a lot of saltier foods or snacks or things typically around this time. Also, increased alcohol consumption. Increased alcohol consumption will actually lead to more water retention and holding on to more water because it actually can be somewhat dehydrating to our bodies, which means dehydrating to our cells, but we may actually hold on to a little bit more water overall. And then lastly, carbohydrates and sugar. And this is not at all, as you've probably gathered so far, this is not at all for me to demonize them, but typically we are going to be eating more carbohydrates and sugar during this time. What that does, and specifically if you're someone who eats maybe a little less carb or lower carb in your typical life or doesn't have a lot of sugar, what this does is when we eat sugar and carbohydrates, they are eventually turned into glucose, which is, we see it in our blood and lab values. It's called blood glucose. And what that does is that actually feeds all of the cells in our body. It will, if it's in excess or just generally after a meal, if our body doesn't utilize all of it, it will get stored in our liver and in our muscles. And so this is actually a really beneficial thing for a lot of people who are active. It's like we want to actually have some of that water retention because what that does is the more glycogen that we have, we basically have 15 molecules of glucose and sugar for every 1 molecule of glycogen. And what happens there is that there's also, for every molecule of sugar, there's 2 molecules of water attached to it. So basically, the more sugar that we eat or carbs that we eat that eventually get broken down into glucose, we will end up retaining more water. And for some people, that's actually really great because the more glycogen and energy, that's basically what that is, energy we have stored in our muscles is the more power and ability we have to go do active things in our life. So it's not inherently a bad thing, but if anyone's ever been on a keto diet or a low carb diet, and if you've noticed a drastic anywhere from 10 to 15 pound weight loss in that first week or two, and then if you do choose to start eating a little bit more carbs, you see a drastic weight gain. All that is water loss and then water gain again. So that's something to think about too, is like, why are we maybe gaining some of this weight? It's probably just due to water retention, and typically it will normalize in about a week-ish or so. So it's not something to totally freak out about, but it's something I think that it's important to put into context. Okay, so here are some takeaways as we wrap up of looking at how do we actually start to savor the holidays and how do we start to create and bring in some of this mindfulness and some of these tools of tapping into our hunger cues, understanding why are we eating, and all these different things. So first and foremost, it's eating enough. Don't save up your calories. Don't skip breakfast in anticipation of a larger meal, because what will happen is once we get to that meal, we will end up eating more than we're most likely comfortable with. And then we will end up reinforcing that pattern of, well, I did a bad job. This food's unhealthy, blah, 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 blah. And then we'll want to restart and go through a restriction. So first and foremost, just look at eating enough. Next, we want to look at how do we provide a variety of foods throughout the day. So yes, typically holiday foods are going to be a little bit richer They'll have a little bit more butter in them. They'll have a little bit more fat. They'll have a little bit more sugar in them. And so it's really important when we are eating these foods of what is actually satisfying to me. So sometimes it can be helpful to be like, how is this going to make me feel, right? If I house an entire plate of dessert after a full meal, it may not make me feel the best. And that's also my choice. I can choose that, but allowing yourself to choose that is really important. So asking yourself, like, how is this going to make me feel? Not saying that, like, easily, probably one slice of pie or even maybe two throughout the day is probably going to make you feel just fine and normal. But again, if we've gone into it trying to restrict all of the cookies and all the pies and all the things, and then we end up eating a lot of it because we're already in that black and white screw up mentality, typically this will end in not feeling so great afterwards. Another thing that's helpful is to focus on balanced meals earlier in the day. And what I mean by this is balanced, meaning that we are having a meal that has some sort of protein in it. So, some sort of protein, as in whether that be, say, breakfast, for instance. Maybe that's some sort of like yogurt. Maybe that has, maybe it's going to be eggs, something like that that has some protein in it. Because what that does is that's going to actually decrease our blood sugar response. And it's actually going to digest slower so that we feel more sustained for a period of time. Also, one thing that's typically lacking in a lot of holiday meals is fiber. Fiber is only going to be found in plant foods, and typically we're going to find this in high amounts in fruits and vegetables. And so, typically, again, a classic traditional holiday meal won't have a lot of vegetables in it. What this fiber does is we actually don't digest it as humans. We don't fully digest it, and it ends up just taking up some space, but it also does slow down that digestion aspect as well. So that's where focusing on, okay, it's the holiday, it's Christmas Day or it's Christmas Eve, or it's New Year's or whatever, and I know that I'm going to have this larger meal now. So maybe I'm going to focus on getting in some of those foods that I know make me feel good and will provide a little bit more balance in my day. So I'm going to include a vegetable or a fruit here, so that I don't feel like I'm crashing instantly. So that can be one thing to think about too. And also just providing variety. If you are the one who gets the opportunity to host a family or meals, make sure that there is a variety of foods. You don't have to healthify grandma's favorite recipe, and you don't have to healthify your favorite recipe, but making sure that there is a variety of possibly some of these protein foods and some sort of like vegetable or something like that, so that people have access to it and so that you also give yourself access to it. If you don't provide yourself access to it, you're not going to eat it. So that's step one. Um, Another thing is typically we have a lot of buffet style things over the holidays. Um, I found myself historically previously of like getting everything because I'm like, well, I don't get these foods very often. But then when I actually think about it, I'm like, I actually don't really like cranberry sauce. I don't actually really like sweet potatoes or whatever. And so it's looking at really spending time and filling up with the things that you actually want and that actually make you feel good and remind you most of the holidays. Okay, another important thing is to ask, why am I eating, right? So if you find yourself more so mindlessly eating, check in. Like, am I hungry? Is this because I'm stressed? Is it because I just wanted a taste of something? Or is it because I just needed something to do? Just ask yourself, why am I eating right now? And a lot of times, don't make yourself feel guilty about it, but just check in, like, no, I'm not hungry. And I actually am satisfied. Oh, I might go do something else. Again, don't restrict certain foods, and especially dessert foods, because it's the only time of the year we get Christmas cookies. It's the only time of year we get a lot of these foods, and this perpetuates that all or nothing mentality. So I encourage you to savor and enjoy and be present while eating these foods, because right now I'm going home for Christmas. It's my grandmother's night. It was just her 90th birthday, and her favorite holiday in the whole wide world is Christmas. She loves having everyone together. Um, and now, because she's getting older, she has lost a significant amount of weight due to muscle wasting and things like that. And now she's, quote unquote, finally at her goal weight, right? And because Christmas is her favorite holiday, she also has not as much function as she used to in all these other aspects, but she has spent every other Christmas, which is her favorite holiday, stressing and worrying about her weight. So I just want you to ask yourself too, to really zoom out before you start to get down on yourself about these things, or really anxious, of zooming out of, what do I want to remember about this holiday and time together? And it's, again, most likely not stressing about food. Last thing is movement. So moving actually isn't really going to make a big difference in your overall calorie expenditure. So, how much calories you burn. When we think about it, we can typically burn, I don't know, depends on everyone, but a few hundred calories an hour. That's not going to put a huge dent into foods that we're eating. But movement is really helpful if you're someone who has type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease. It's really, really helpful for management of those diseases. It's also really good for mental health. The holiday season is deeply stressful, especially around family members, sometimes lovely, but also sometimes stressful. And so sometimes movement can be a way that can help relieve stress and give you a little bit of you time on your own so that you can be ready and prepared to go into those situations. Again, it's not going to cancel out calories, but it's also a way that we can find connection and connection with maybe family, friends, or kids of like, oh, hey, we're going to go out on a walk. Maybe it's snowing. We're going to go out on a snowy walk before we come in and eat and things like that. And so it can be a way that is really helpful to connect us and make us feel grounded and make us feel more present in what we're doing. So those are my main tips of look at eating enough, not restricting, making sure you're not denying yourself. And if, again, you eat a little bit more than you intended, that's okay. And give yourself a little bit of grace. And again, zoom out and think about overall, what do I need right now? All right, thank you all for your time today. And I'm here if you want to either unmute yourself or if you have any questions in the chat, feel free to pop them in there and let me know.
Thanks, Abby.
You're
I
welcome.
uh, I wanted to know what do you recommend? You kind of touched upon it, but do you have something you recommend for breakfast? Like you talked about eating protein, but you're heading into like a big, Christmas Eve dinner or a New Year's Eve dinner with family. Like what do you recommend that somebody have for breakfast? Like what would be your go-to things?
Great question. So, especially if there's going to be a lot of people around, if doing some sort of like egg bake or quiche or something like that can be helpful because we're going to get some of that protein in. Also, we can throw some veggies in there as well, which can be a really good, easy choice. Typically, you can also make it in that large volume. So that will be helpful. So something like that, if people don't eat eggs, you can look at getting something that's going to be a little bit more high in fiber. Maybe it's like a oatmeal bar, right? So you have a big oatmeal bar that has like some yogurt available or nuts available to get in some of that protein and some of that fiber, but have some fun toppings to make it interesting as well.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. Anyone else have any questions?